Have you ever wondered what's worse than smuggling illegal substances across galactic borders? How about accidentally kidnapping an admiral's teenage son who thinks he's the next space pirate? This is exactly the situation Captain Cass and his crew of the Wide Margin found themselves in, and let me tell you, it's not the kind of story that ends with a simple slap on the wrist. In the vast expanse of space, where stars twinkled like scattered diamonds against the velvet void, the Wide Margin drifted silently through hyperspace. The small cargo ship, with its worn hull and patched-up systems, had seen better days, but it had always been a faithful companion to its crew of feline smugglers. Captain Cass, a seasoned spacer with whiskers that twitched at the slightest hint of trouble, was currently experiencing the worst anxiety attack of his life. The source of his distress lurked in the corner of the ship's galley, draped in what appeared to be a bedsheet dyed black, with questionable success. The human teenager's attempt at looking menacing was about as effective as a kitten trying to roar. His green eyes, surrounded by hastily applied black makeup that was now smearing from sweat, peered out from beneath a hood that refused to stay in place. The overall effect was less terrifying space pirate and more kid who raided his sister's makeup drawer. The galley, usually a place of comfort with its dented metal tables and duct-taped booth upholstery, had become a war room of sorts. The 7 Felinian crew members, Cass, Vim, Mac, Nid, Dob, Zip and Red, sat around their unwanted guest, their tails twitching in synchronized anxiety. The smell of their last coffee smuggling run still lingered in the air, mixing with the distinct scent of teenage humor and cheap black hair dye. "You know," Cass said, running his clawed fingers through his facial fur for the 100th time. "When I decided to become a smuggler, I thought the worst thing that could happen would be getting caught with a holdful of illegal coffee beans. I never imagined I'd be facing the wrath of Florida parents." The boy, who had been attempting to maintain what he probably thought was a mysterious and brooding silence, perked up at this. "I told you," he declared in an obviously forced deep voice that cracked mid-sentence. "You can call me Dark Knife." Vim, the ship's engineer and resident voice of sarcasm, snorted so hard she nearly fell off her seat. "Listen, Dorkstride," she said, ignoring the boy's indignant sputter. "You don't seem to understand the gravity of our situation. We're not worried about the authorities, we're worried about your parents." The mention of parents caused the boy to slouch further into his makeshift cloak, but it didn't stop him from trying to salvage his dramatic persona. "I chose this ship because you're the bravest crew I could find on Tampa Station," he declared, attempting to strike a pose that was somewhat undermined by the way he had to keep adjusting his slipping hood. "Brave?" Mac wheezed, his whiskers practically vibrating with hysteria. "Kid, we're coffee smugglers. The most dangerous thing we usually face is a customs officer with a caffeine addiction. We're not equipped to handle Florida man and Florida woman on a parental rampage." The mention of Florida caused a collective shudder to run through the crew. Stories of the infamous Florida residents had spread across the galaxy, tales that made even the most hardened space pirates think twice about crossing their path. And now they had unwittingly stolen the most precious cargo of all, a Florida teenager with delusions of grandeur. As Cass watched their stowaway attempt to maintain his dignity while simultaneously fighting with his constantly slipping cloak, he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to change careers. Perhaps space piracy wasn't so bad after all. At least pirates only had to worry about being shot, not being hunted down by enraged Florida parents with military connections. Little did they know, their situation was about to get much, much worse. Hey space adventurers, if you're enjoying this tale of unfortunate smugglers and their teenage trouble, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, activate those notification bells to stay updated on more galactic misadventures. Now, let's dive back into our story and see just how deep this cosmic mess goes. The Wide Margin's galley had never felt smaller than it did in that moment. 7 Felinian smugglers, each with their own colorful history of minor crimes and questionable life choices, sat in various states of panic, while their teenage stowaway continued his attempt at maintaining a mysterious aura. "The bravest crew!" Dorkstrife proclaimed again, leaping onto the metal table with all the grace of a drunken space whale. The ancient piece of furniture groaned ominously under his weight, swaying just enough to make Cass's heart skip several beats. "Together we'll become legends! Just think of all the other smugglers you can intimidate with a Terran warrior aboard!" Nid, the ship's navigator who had been quietly pulling out chunks of his own fur, finally snapped. "Warrior? You're wearing your sister's leggings under that cloak. I saw them when you were sneaking into the cargo hold." "They're tactical pants," Dorkstrife protested, his voice cracking spectacularly on tactical. Cass watched as his carefully constructed life of moderate criminal success began to crumble around him. The coffee smuggling business had been good, profitable enough to keep the Wide Margin flying, but not so lucrative as to attract serious attention. Now, thanks to one teenager's space piracy fantasies, they were about to become the most wanted ship in the galaxy. "Look," Vim said, trying to reason with their unwanted passenger. "Why don't we just call your parents? I'm sure they'll be understanding. She trailed off as the entire crew turned to stare at her in horror. Understanding? Max squeaked, his tail puffing up to twice its normal size. Understanding? Have you ever met Florida parents? They once declared war on a solar system because someone suggested their kid wasn't good at sport. That's just a rumor, Dorkstrife muttered, but he looked considerably less certain than before. Red, who had been quietly calculating their chances of survival in the corner, finally spoke up. I've done the math. If we turn ourselves in now, we have a 12% chance of surviving long enough to explain we didn't actually kidnap anyone. If we wait until they find us, and they will find us, that drops to 0.3%. But what about our dreams of adventure? Dorkstrike pleaded, his makeup now thoroughly smeared across his face like an abstract art piece gone wrong. We could be space pirates. Think of the glory. Glory? Cass felt his last nerve finally snap. Kid, do you know what real space pirates do? They file paperwork, mountains of paperwork, insurance claims, cargo manifestos, union dues. It's all bureaucracy with occasional bouts of mild theft. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft whimper of dreams being crushed under the weight of reality. Dorkstrike's shoulders slumped, his carefully crafted image of space piracy dissolving faster than his cheap makeup. Fine, he mumbled, finally dropping the fake deep voice. I'll call my mum, but you don't understand, she's going to be so mad. The crew exchanged glances, each thinking the same thing. This kid had no idea what real anger looked like. They were about to find out just how deep space wasn't deep enough when dealing with an enraged Florida mother. As Zip set course for the nearest communication relay, Cass caught a glimpse of something on their Stowaway's personal tablet, a family photo that made his blood run cold. There, standing proudly in a Republican Navy uniform adorned with admiral stars, was a woman whose stern expression could probably command respect from a black hole. The sweet ancestors, Cass whispered, his whiskers drooping in defeat. We didn't just pick up any Florida kid, we picked up an admiral's son. The collective groan that echoed through the wide margins halls might have been mistaken for a ship-wide system failure by passing vessels. In reality, it was just the sound of 7 smugglers realizing their lives were about to become a lot more interesting than they'd ever wanted. The ship's office had never felt more like an execution chamber. The holoscreen's soft blue glow cast eerie shadows across the faces of the crew as they huddled behind their teenage nightmare, who was finally beginning to look appropriately terrified. The call waiting tone echoed through the small space, each chime another nail in their collective coffin. When the connection finally established, the image that materialized before them was worse than any of their fears. Admiral Sarah Constantine, decorated officer of the Republican Navy, appeared in full uniform, her emerald eyes blazing with the kind of fury that could melt starship hulls. The stars on her shoulders seemed to gleam with menace. Dear James Constantine, she began, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded supernovas. Would you care to explain why your Aunt Julie found your bedroom empty with a note saying, and I quote, "Gone to seek my destiny among the stars"? Dorkstripe, or rather Derek, seemed to shrink 3 sizes under his mother's gaze. His carefully crafted space pirate persona evaporated faster than water in a vacuum. The black makeup around his eyes had smeared so badly, he now looked like a raccoon caught in ship's headlights. Hi Mom, he squeaked, his attempted bass rumble completely abandoned. Made some friends. The Admiral's eyes swept past her son to the crew cowering behind him. 7 feline smugglers, each with their own impressive record of minor crimes and misdemeanors, tried their best to look like upstanding citizens who had absolutely not been harboring a runaway teenager. Friends, the Admiral repeated, the word carrying enough weight to bend light. Would these be the same friends who've been running illegal coffee through 3 sectors and managed to avoid detection for the past 8 months? Cass felt his tail go completely rigid. How did she know about the coffee? They'd been so careful. Actually, Derek began, apparently finding a spark of his earlier bravado. They didn't know I was aboard until we were already in hyperspace. I snuck in through the cargo hold while they were loading coffee on Tampa Station. They've been trying to convince me to call you since they found me. The Admiral's expression shifted minutely, not enough to be called soft, but perhaps slightly less likely to result in their immediate vaporization. Is that so? Yes, 7 Felinian voices chorused in desperate harmony. And you didn't think to call the authorities immediately upon finding my son? The Admiral asked, her tone suggesting she already knew exactly why they hadn't. Well, Cass stepped forward, figuring if he was going to die he might as well die with dignity. We thought facing the authorities with our cargo might be preferable to facing Florida parents who thought we'd kidnapped their child. But your son was quite persistent in his refusal to make contact. Persistent, the Admiral echoed, and for a brief moment, something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. Yes, he gets that from his father. Speaking of which, The image widened to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man in civilian clothes, his arms crossed and expression stern. "Son," he said, "did you use your sister's makeup to try to look like a space pirate again?" "Dad," Derek protested, his face flushing red beneath the smeared cosmetics. "It's not makeup, it's tactical face paint." "That's my new liquid eyeliner," a teenage girl's voice called from somewhere off-screen. "And my good leggings." The situation was rapidly devolving from terrifying to mortifying, and Cass wasn't sure which was worse. The crew watched in fascinated horror as their fearsome stowaway transformed into just another embarrassed teenager being called out by his family. "Now then," Admiral Constantine's voice cut through the family drama like a laser through hull plating. "About that coffee smuggling operation." The crew collectively held their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, but the Admiral's next words would change everything they thought they knew about their situation and launch them into an adventure far bigger than anything Derek had imagined in his wildest space pirate fantasies. The tension in the ship's office could have been cut with a plasma knife as Admiral Constantine's words hung in the recycled air. Her next statement, however, was not what anyone expected. "Your little coffee operation has been quite impressive," she said, leaning forward slightly. 7 successful runs through heavily monitored sectors, creative cargo manifests, and not a single trace left behind, except, of course, for the traces we wanted to find. Cass felt his whiskers droop. Of course, they'd been played from the start, but why would an admiral be tracking small-time coffee smugglers? "The thing is," she continued, her emerald eyes scanning each crew member in turn, "we've been watching your operation for months, not to shut it down, but to evaluate your capabilities. You've demonstrated exceptional skill in evading detection, maintaining secure transport routes, and handling, unexpected situations." Her gaze flickered to her son, who had the decency to look sheepish. "But Mum," Derek interrupted, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" "Quiet, Derek," both parents said in unison. The Admiral straightened her already impeccable uniform. "The Republican Navy has a situation that requires a crew with your particular set of skills. A crew that operates outside official channels but maintains a strong moral compass. A crew that can handle delicate cargo and keep secrets." Mac's tail started twitching violently. "Are you offering us a job?" "More like an opportunity to avoid prison while serving your republic," Admiral Constantine's husband interjected with a slight smile, "though the pay is considerably better than your current operation." Cass found his voice at last. "With all due respect, Admiral, why would you trust a group of smugglers who accidentally kidnapped your son?" "Because you didn't kidnap him," she replied. "You found a stowaway and, despite the risk to yourselves, tried to do the right thing. That says more about your character than any background check could reveal." The crew exchanged glances. This had to be some sort of trap, right? "Of course," the Admiral added, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "This offer is contingent upon you returning my son immediately and unharmed, after which we can discuss the details of your first official-unofficial mission." "What kind of mission?" Vim asked, her curiosity getting the better of her caution. "One that makes your coffee smuggling look like a cargo run to the corner store," Admiral Constantine replied. "We need you to infiltrate the Centaurian black market and track down something that was stolen from a secure facility, something that could destabilize 3 sectors if it falls into the wrong hand." Derek's eyes lit up with the same dangerous gleam they'd had when he first proclaimed himself Dark Knife. "Does this mean I can—" "No," his parents said simultaneously. "That? You're grounded until you're 30, his father stated firmly, "and your sister wants her leggings back." As the reality of their situation sank in, Cass realized they'd somehow stumbled from one impossible situation into an even more complicated one. They'd gone from coffee smugglers to potential covert operatives in the span of a single holocall, and judging by the Admiral's expression, refusing wasn't really an option. "Well," Cass said, looking at his crew, "I guess we're about to find out if we're as good at smuggling as we thought we were." "First," Admiral Constantine interrupted, "you're going to bring my son home. Then we'll talk about your new career path. And Derek, wash your face before I see you. You look like you lost a fight with a paint dispenser." The holocall ended, leaving the crew in stunned silence. Their simple life of coffee smuggling had just become infinitely more complicated, and somehow they all knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger adventure. Derek, still wrapped in his makeshift cloak, finally broke the silence. "So? Does this mean I don't get to be a space pirate?" 7 groans echoed through the wide margins office, followed by the sound of multiple Felinian heads hitting the nearest solid surface. The wide margin cut through hyperspace like a knife through butter, its engines humming with a nervous energy that seemed to match its crew's state of mind. In the ship's galley, Derek sat slumped at the table, his face now clean of makeup, but wearing an expression that suggested he'd rather face a black hole than his waiting family. "You know," Zip said, breaking the uncomfortable silence as he fiddled with the ship's navigation controls. When I signed up for this crew, I thought the worst thing we'd have to deal with was dodging customs patrols. Now we're about to become some kind of covert operatives for the Republican Navy? If we survive returning the Admiral's son, Ned muttered, still obsessively grooming his whiskers. Has anyone noticed we're flying straight into Tampa Station, the same station he ran away from, where his entire family is waiting? Cass paced the length of the galley, his tail swishing in agitation. The Admiral's offer kept playing in his mind. It wasn't really an offer though, was it? More like an elegantly wrapped ultimatum, prison or service. Although the promise of legitimate work, well, semi-legitimate, with actual payment, was tempting. I still don't understand why I can't stay, Derek grumbled, picking at the edge of the table. We could be an awesome team. I mean, think about it. You're already getting official missions now, so technically... Oh, kid, Vim interrupted. You're wearing your sister's leggings? They're tactical. If you say tactical pants one more time, Red warned, I'm going to jettison you through the waste disposal. The ship's comm system crackled to life. Captain, Mac's voice came through. We're approaching Tampa Station, and you might want to see this. The crew rushed to the bridge, crowding around the main viewport. Tampa Station loomed before them, its massive structure gleaming in the light of the system's sun. But it wasn't the station that had caught Mac's attention. It was the 3 Republican Navy destroyers flanking their assigned docking bay. Sweet ancestors, Cass whispered. She really isn't taking any chances, is she? Mom can be a bit protective, Derek admitted, suddenly looking very small in his borrowed cloak. The docking procedure was textbook perfect. None of the crew dared to make even the slightest mistake under the watchful eyes of 3 warships. As the airlock sealed and the docking clamps engaged, Cass turned to their young stowaway. Well, kid, this is where we part ways. Try not to run away and hide in any more smuggler ships, okay? Derek stood straighter, trying to muster some dignity. I still think you're making a mistake. We could have been legends, the greatest space pirates in the galaxy. We're about to become covert operatives for your mother instead, Vin pointed out. Somehow, that's actually more terrifying than being space pirates. The airlock cycled open to reveal not just Admiral Constantine and her husband, but what appeared to be half the station's security force. Derek's sister, who immediately demanded her leggings back, and his Aunt Julie, who looked torn between relief and exasperation. As they watched Derek being marched away by his family, Cass couldn't help but notice the Admiral's slight nod in their direction, a nod that clearly said, "We'll be in touch." So, Mac said, breaking the heavy silence that followed. Anyone else missing the simple days of coffee smuggling? The crew's collective groan was interrupted by a ping from their communication console, a message from Republican Navy Command, classified Priority 1, with coordinates for their first briefing. Their new life was about to begin, and somehow they all knew that their adventure with Derek, or Darkknife as he'd probably always insist, was just the prologue to a much bigger story. Well, Cass sighed, straightening his whiskers, I guess we better go see what the Admiral has in store for us. After all, how much worse could it be than having a teenage wannabe space pirate aboard? The universe, as it turned out, was more than ready to answer that question. The meeting room deep within Tampa Station's secure sector made the wide margins cramped office feel spacious by comparison. Cass and his crew sat around a polished table, their tails twitching nervously as Admiral Constantine activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room. 3 days ago, she began without preamble, this was stolen from Research Station Omega. The hologram showed a small cylindrical device, no bigger than a coffee can. We call it the quantum cipher. In the wrong hands, it could decrypt any secure communication in 3 sectors. Let me guess, Vim interjected, her whiskers quivering. It ended up in the Centaurian black market. Worse, the Admiral's expression darkened. It's being auctioned off. Every criminal organization, rival government and terrorist cell will be there. And you're going to infiltrate the auction. Matt choked on his water. Us? At the galaxy's biggest gathering of criminals? Exactly, Admiral Constantine smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You see, thanks to my son's adventure, your ship has gained quite a reputation. Word has spread that the Wide Margin managed to kidnap an admiral's child and live to tell about it. But we didn't, Nid started to protest. Of course you didn't, but the criminal underworld doesn't know that. They think you pulled off the most daring kidnapping in recent history and somehow negotiated your way out of it. Your stock has never been higher. Cass felt his fur stand on end. You planned this, didn't you? Using your own son's escapade as our cover story? Let's just say I've learned to make the best of unexpected situations, the Admiral replied smoothly. The auction is in 5 days. You'll be going in as buyers, backed by your new reputation. Your mission is to locate the cipher and mark it with a quantum tracker before it's sold. Red raised a paw. And if something goes wrong? Then 3 Republican Navy battle groups will be standing by to crash the party. The Admiral's smile turned predatory. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. The last thing we need is a firefight in the middle of the sector's largest gathering of criminals. The hologram changed to show detailed schematics of the auction venue, an abandoned mining station in neutral space. As the Admiral went through the mission parameters, Cass couldn't help but notice how much more complex this was than their usual coffee runs. One more thing, Admiral Constantine added, almost as an afterthought. My son is grounded indefinitely, but knowing him, he might try to participate in this mission. If you see him anywhere near that auction, you have my permission to stuff him in a cargo container and ship him straight back here. Speaking from experience, Zip asked before he could stop himself. Let's just say Derek comes by his adventurous spirit honestly, she replied with a hint of what might have been pride. I was quite the handful myself at his age. Why do you think I joined the Navy? The briefing continued with detailed assignments, cover stories, and contingency plans. By the time they left the meeting room, the crew of the Wide Margin had transformed from simple coffee smugglers into covert operatives on their first official mission. As they walked back to their ship, Cass noticed a familiar figure trying to hide behind a support column. The black cloak was gone, replaced by what appeared to be a maintenance worker's uniform. Derek, Cass called out without breaking stride. Your mother said to tell you that if you try to stow away again, she'll have you assigned as a janitor on an ice mining colony. The maintenance uniform disappeared remarkably quickly into the station's crowds. You know, Vim said as they boarded the Wide Margin, I'm starting to think coffee smuggling wasn't so bad after all. The ship's engines hummed to life as they prepared for their most dangerous mission yet. Somewhere in the vastness of space, a quantum cipher waited to be found, and the crew of the Wide Margin was about to discover that their adventures with Derek were just the beginning of something much bigger. As they cleared the station's docking area, Cass couldn't help but wonder if they should check their cargo hold one more time, just in case. The Wide Margin drifted in deep space, far enough from any major shipping lanes to avoid unwanted attention. Inside, the crew was undergoing the most intense makeover of their lives. "I look ridiculous," Cass growled, tugging at the elaborate vest that now covered his fur. The garment, studded with precious stones and threaded with gold, screamed, "Successful criminal," so loudly it might as well have come with its own warning sirens. "That's the point," Vim replied, adjusting her own outfit, a sleek black ensemble that made her look like a corporate assassin. "We're supposed to be flashy new players with more money than sense, the kind of idiots who'd actually try to kidnap an admiral's kid." The ship's cargo hold had been transformed as well. Gone were the hidden compartments for coffee beans, replaced with luxury items, and enough legitimate cargo to support their cover as successful smugglers turned high-end traders. The Admiral's resources had proven surprisingly extensive. "Run through the cover story again," Red demanded, practicing his swagger in front of a mirror. Mac cleared his throat dramatically. "We're the crew who pulled off the Admiral's son heist. After negotiating our freedom, we decided to move up in the world. Now we represent a consortium of wealthy clients interested in acquiring unique items. The kidnapping was just to prove we could handle high-risk, high-reward jobs." "And if anyone asks about Derek specifically?" Nid prompted. "We say nothing," Cass stated firmly. "Just smile mysteriously and change the subject. Let them fill in the blanks with their own imagination." A beeping from the bridge interrupted their rehearsal. Zip's voice came through the intercom, tense with alarm. "Captain, we've got company. Unregistered ship, coming in fast." The crew rushed to their stations, all thoughts of their cover stories forgotten. On the main screen, a sleek vessel approached, its design unlike anything they'd seen before. "Incoming transmission," Zip announced. The screen flickered to life, revealing a face that made every Felinian aboard freeze in place. The alien's features were hidden behind an ornate mask, but its voice carried the weight of authority and danger. "Wide Margin," the figure purred. "I believe we have mutual interests to discuss. The auction, perhaps?" Cass felt his new vest suddenly become very tight. This wasn't part of the plan. The Admiral had warned them about making contact before reaching the auction site, but refusing this call could blow their cover before they even started. "I'm listening," Cass replied, trying to channel every bit of criminal confidence he could muster. "The item you seek. It's attracted quite a lot of attention. Perhaps we could coordinate our efforts?" Before Cass could respond, a small alert flashed on his private screen, a message from Admiral Constantine. "Play along, this is expected." The game, it seemed, had already begun, and as Cass prepared to negotiate with their mysterious contact, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere on Tampa Station, a certain teenage wannabe space pirate was plotting his next move. The Wide Margin's transformation from coffee smuggling vessel to player in galactic espionage was about to face its first real test. And this time, there would be no admiral standing by to clean up their mistakes. "Let's talk business," Cass said to the masked figure, praying to his ancestors that he wasn't about to get them all killed. The response came with a chuckle that sent chills down every spine in the bridge. "Oh, we're going to do much more than talk." The masked figure's hologram loomed over the wide margins bridge, casting an eerie glow across the nervous faces of the crew. "I represent certain interested parties," the figure continued, each word carefully measured. "We've been watching your recent rise with great interest. The Admiral's son incident was particularly impressive." Cass forced his whiskers to remain still, fighting every instinct to groom them in anxiety. "We prefer to let our work speak for itself." "Indeed." The mask tilted slightly, studying them. "Then perhaps you'd care to explain why your ship's power signature matches that of a vessel recently seen near Republican Navy installations." The bridge fell silent. Even the ship's usual hum seemed to hold its breath. Cass felt his heart skip several beats, but years of smuggling had taught him one vital lesson. When caught in a lie, double down with a bigger one. "Of course it does," Cass replied smoothly, adjusting his gaudy vest. "Where do you think we got our information about the Admiral's movements? We didn't just stumble into that operation by accident." The masked figure leaned forward slightly. "Is that so? You don't successfully negotiate with the Republican Navy without having inside contacts," Vim added, catching on to Cass's strategy. "How else do you think we walked away free?" A low chuckle emerged from behind the mask. Clever, ever. Very clever. But let's discuss something more immediate. The quantum. What about it? Cass kept his voice neutral, though his tail was practically vibrating with tension. "We know you're planning to bid. We also know you're not the only ones. The auction will be competitive." The figure paused meaningfully. "Perhaps we could arrange a mutual understanding before things become messy." Just then, a secondary alert flashed on Cass's screen, not from the Admiral this time, but from their own security systems. Something was moving in the cargo hold. "An interesting proposition," Cass replied, trying to buy time while simultaneously signaling Mac to check the cargo hold. "What kind of understanding did you have in mind?" The masked figure began outlining an elaborate scheme involving multiple bidders and staged conflict, but Cass was only half listening. His attention was split between maintaining his criminal facade and watching Mac's security feed from the cargo hold. There, moving between the luxury cargo containers, was a shadow that shouldn't exist, a shadow wearing what appeared to be a maintenance uniform. Sweet ancestors, Cass thought. He didn't. But of course he did. Somehow, despite all precautions, all warnings, and probably several layers of security, Derek had managed to stow away again, and this time they were headed straight into the galaxy's most dangerous gathering of criminals, while entertaining a mysterious masked figure who could blow their cover at any moment. "Captain?" The masked figure's voice cut through Cass's internal panic. "You seem distracted." "Not at all," Cass recovered quickly. "I was just considering the implications of your proposal. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in person, at the auction." "Indeed." The mask seemed to smile somehow. "Until then, Captain. Oh, and one more thing." The figure paused dramatically. "Do give my regards to your newest crew member, the one currently hiding in your cargo hold." The transmission cut off before Cass could respond, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. "Well," Vinge said finally, "I guess we know why the Admiral gave us permission to stuff him in a cargo container." Cass slumped in his captain's chair, wondering if it was too late to go back to coffee smuggling. But, as Mac's voice came through the comm confirming their stowaway's presence, he knew they were well past the point of no return. "Get him up here," Cass ordered, rubbing his temples. "And someone contact the Admiral. Tell her—" He paused, considering their options. "Tell her we may have accidentally kidnapped her son." Again. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all, and somewhere behind that mysterious mask, someone was laughing at them all. "I can explain," Derek burst out the moment he was dragged onto the bridge, still wearing the maintenance uniform that had fooled absolutely no one. His face was smeared with grease this time, instead of makeup, though the effect was remarkably similar. "Can you?" Cass asked, his tail lashing back and forth. "Can you explain why you're here when your mother specifically threatened you with ice mining duty? Can you explain why you chose to reveal yourself during a critical conversation with a mysterious potential ally? Or perhaps you'd like to explain how you managed to bypass station security?" "Actually," Derek brightened, "the security bypass was pretty cool. I used the ventilation." "That was rhetorical," 7 voices shouted in unison. The ship's comm system crackled to life, displaying an incoming call from Tampa Station. Everyone froze, staring at the blinking light like it was an armed explosive. "Oh, sweet ancestors," Need whimpered. "It's your mother." But when they answered, it wasn't Admiral Constantine's face that appeared on the screen. Instead, they found themselves looking at Derek's sister, her expression a mixture of exasperation and amusement. "So," she said, "he made it aboard after all." "Julie," Derek exclaimed, "you promised not to tell." "I promise no such thing, little brother. In fact," she grinned wickedly, "Mum's been tracking your movements since you left the station. She's on her way to her office right now to call you." As if on cue, another incoming call notification appeared. "Wait," Cass said, his whiskers twitching in sudden suspicion. "Your mother knew he would try this?" "Of course she did," Julie replied. "Why do you think she specifically mentioned not to let him near the auction? She practically guaranteed he'd try to come along." She paused, her grin widening. "By the way, that mysterious masked figure you were just talking to, let's just say our family has a complicated relationship with theatrical entrants." The implications hit the crew like a meteor strike. They'd been played. Again. "You mean?" Thim started. "That was your mother?" Red finished. Derek looked as shocked as the rest of them. But the voice, the mask." "Advanced holographic technology," Julie explained cheerfully. "Mum's been testing your new friends, making sure they can handle unexpected situations. Congratulations, wide margin crew, you passed the first test." The second incoming call continued to blink insistently. "You should probably answer that," Julie suggested. "Oh, and Derek, Mum says to tell you that since you're already there, you might as well make yourself useful, but you're still grounded until you're 30. The transmission cut off, leaving the crew staring at each other in bewilderment, while the Admiral's call waited for answer. "So," Derek said hopefully, "does this mean I get to stay?" Cass looked at his crew, then at the incoming call, then back at their persistent stowaway. "You know what? Let's let your mother answer that question." As he reached for the comm controls, Cass couldn't help but wonder what other tests the Admiral had planned for them. Somehow, he suspected that managing her son's adventure might be the most challenging part of their mission. The screen flickered to life, revealing Admiral Constantine's face. She wasn't wearing a mask this time, but her smile was just as mysterious as the one they'd seen earlier. "Well," she said, "shall we discuss the real mission now?" The Admiral's face filled the wide margin's main screen, her expression now devoid of the theatrical menace from earlier. Behind her, Cass could see the familiar walls of her office, decorated with holographic star charts and military commendations. "First," she said, fixing her son with a look that could have melted hull plating, "Derek, that maintenance uniform belongs to Chief Peterson. He's been looking for it for the past hour." Derek shuffled his feet. "I left him a note." "Yes, I saw it. Borrowed for Galactic emergency. Will return someday. Very professional." The Admiral's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Now, since you're determined to be part of this operation, you might as well know what you've stumbled into." The holographic display shifted, showing a three-dimensional map of the sector. Red dots appeared, marking various locations across space. "The quantum cipher isn't just a decryption device," Admiral Constantine continued. "It's bait. We've been tracking a mole in our intelligence division for months. Someone's been selling classified information to the highest bidder. The auction is our chance to identify not just the mole, but every major player in the sector's criminal underground." "And we're supposed to be what?" Cass asked. "Bait within bait?" "Precisely. Your reputation as the crew who successfully negotiated with me after kidnapping my son makes you perfect infiltrators. No one would suspect you're actually working for me." She paused, glancing at Derek, though some of us seem determined to complicate matters. "I can help," Derek protested. "I know all about covert ops. I've read every spy novel in the station's database." "Reading spy novels doesn't make you a spy," Vim pointed out. "No," the Admiral agreed. "But being my son means he's grown up around enough classified operations to be dangerous. Since he's already involved, we might as well use that to our advantage." The crew exchanged worried glances. They'd gone from coffee smugglers to covert operatives, and now they were about to become handlers for a teenage spy in training. "The auction begins in 3 days," Admiral Constantine continued. "You'll need to establish your presence before then, make connections, spread rumors, build your cover story, and most importantly," she fixed each crew member with a stern look, "keep my son alive. If anything happens to him, prison will be the least of your worries." "What about the masked figure act?" Mac asked. "Won't people recognize your voice?" The Admiral smiled. "That performance was just for you. At the auction, someone else will be playing that role, someone who can help identify our mole. You'll know them by the same mask, but everything else about them will be different." "And if something goes wrong?" Cass asked, already dreading the answer. "Then you'll have to improvise. That's why I chose a crew of smugglers for this mission. You're used to thinking on your feet." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Besides, anyone who can handle my son's attempts at becoming a space pirate can probably handle whatever the criminal underground throws at them." "Mom!" Derek protested, his face reddening. Don't mum me, young man. You're lucky I'm not having you shipped home in a stasis pod. She turned back to Cass. The coordinates for your first contact have been sent to your navigation system. Remember, from this point on, every transmission could be monitored, every contact could be an enemy, and every mistake could be fatal. The screen went dark, leaving the crew to contemplate their new reality. They had 3 days to transform themselves from small-time smugglers into convincing criminal masterminds, all while keeping their teenage charge alive and uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Republican Navy. Well, Derek said brightly, still wearing his stolen maintenance uniform, at least it can't get any worse, right? 7 pairs of Philimian eyes turned to glare at him. What? He asked innocently. I've read enough spy novels to know that's exactly what the hero says before things get really interesting. Cass slumped in his captain's chair, wondering if it was too late to take up ice mining instead. But as Zip announced their course was set for the first rendezvous point, he knew they were committed. The real mission was about to begin, and this time there would be no admiral in a mask to test their responses. The Wide Margin's engines hummed to life, carrying them deeper into a web of intrigue that none of them had signed up for. But then again, as Cass was beginning to realize, that seemed to be becoming a pattern where Derek was concerned. Hey space adventurers, if this cosmic tale of smugglers turned spies has captured your imagination, don't forget to slam that like button harder than a hyperdrive malfunction. Subscribe and activate those notification bells to stay updated on the next thrilling installment. Now, let's dive back into the chaos aboard the Wide Margin. The coordinates led the Wide Margin to an asteroid belt on the fringes of civilized space. Chunks of rock tumbled through the void, creating a natural maze that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. Perfect cover for a clandestine meeting, or a perfect trap. Are you sure about this? Vim asked, watching Derek adjust what appeared to be a homemade utility belt fashioned from spare parts and duct tape. The last time you tried to improve ship equipment, we had to replace 3 storage lockers. This is different, Derek insisted, attaching what looked suspiciously like a modified coffee grinder to his belt. I've been studying spy gear. This is my tactical equipment loadout. Is that my coffee grinder? Mac asked, his whiskers twitching in alarm. It's a high-frequency signal scanner now, Derek replied proudly. I just had to rewire the grinding mechanism and... Incoming ship, Zip's voice cut through their debate, matching the profile we were told to expect. The crew rushed to their stations, leaving Derek fumbling with his makeshift spy gear. On the main screen, a sleek vessel emerged from behind an asteroid, its design suggesting wealth and power. This was no smuggler's ship. This was the kind of vessel used by people who made smugglers nervous. Wide Margin, a voice crackled through their comm system. Prepare for docking, and do try to keep your young associate from attempting any heroics. We'd hate to start our relationship with unnecessary complications. Cass felt his fur stand on end. They hadn't even opened visual communications yet. How did they know about Derek? The docking procedure was tense, each clank and hiss of the airlock mechanisms sounding like potential disaster. When the doors finally opened, they revealed a sight none of them had expected. A Felinian woman stood in the airlock, her fur a striking silver color that seemed to shimmer in the ship's lights. She wore an outfit that screamed dangerous aristocrat, all flowing fabrics and hidden weapons. But it was her eyes that caught everyone's attention. One was cybernetic, glowing with a soft blue light. Well, she purred, I see my sister's little operation has attracted some interesting talent. Her cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on Derek. And some unexpected additions. Sister? Cass managed to ask, his mind racing to keep up with this new development. Oh, did Sarah not mention me? The woman's smile showed just a hint of fang. I'm the black sheep of the family, the one who chose a different path than the prestigious Republican Navy. You can call me Lady Shade. Derek's mouth fell open. Aunt Marina, but Mum said you were... Dead, imprisoned, living as a hermit on a distant moon? Lady Shade laughed. Your mother says many things, dear nephew. Now, shall we discuss your real role in this little game of spies? The crew of the Wide Margin exchanged glances. They'd just discovered that their mission was even more complicated than they'd imagined. And judging by the gleam in Lady Shade's organic eye, they were about to learn just how deep this conspiracy really went. Oh, and Derek, Lady Shade added, glancing at his utility belt. That's not how you modify a coffee grinder for signal scanning. I'll show you the proper way later, assuming, of course, we all survive the next few days. Somehow, that wasn't as reassuring as she probably intended it to be. The Wide Margin's galley had never felt more crowded. Lady Shade lounged in the booth like it was a throne, her cybernetic eye constantly scanning the room while her organic one remained fixed on Cass and his crew. Let me be clear, she said, running a perfectly manicured claw along the table's scarred surface. The quantum cipher isn't just a decryption device. It's a key to something far more dangerous. something that could rewrite the balance of power in this sector and beyond. More dangerous than decrypting military communications? Vim asked, her tail twitching nervously. Lady Soon's laugh was like silk over steel. Oh, my dear, military communications are just the surface. The cipher was designed to access something called Project Lazarus, a Republican Navy black site program that even my dear sister doesn't fully understand. Derek, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly perked up. Project Lazarus, like the ancient Earth myth about rising from the dead. Precisely, nephew, Lady Shade's cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on him. Though in this case, it's not about resurrection, it's about recreation. The ability to recreate any ship, any weapon, any piece of technology by analyzing its quantum signature. The implications hit the crew like a plasma blast. With technology like that, anyone could duplicate the most advanced military hardware in existence. And let me guess, Cass said, his whiskers drooping. The mole isn't just selling secrets. They're planning to steal Project Lazarus itself. Now you're thinking like a proper spy, Lady Shade approved. The auction is a distraction. While everyone fights over the cipher, the real prize will be moved. That's where we come in. We? Max squeaked. Indeed. Your crew's reputation for the Admiral's son incident makes you perfect cover for what needs to be done. No one would suspect you're actually part of a carefully orchestrated plan. She paused, glancing at Derek. Well, mostly carefully orchestrated. Hey, Derek protested. I can help. I've already modified 3 more coffee grinders into... Yes, about that, Lady Shade interrupted. We need to discuss your approach to spycraft, nephew. Starting with the fact that real spies don't announce their modifications to everyone within earshot. The boy deflated slightly, but his eyes still gleamed with determination. So, what's the real plan? Cass asked, trying to steer the conversation back on track. Lady Shade's smile turned predatory. We're going to steal Project Lazarus before the mole can, and we're going to do it during the auction, when everyone who might stop us will be too busy trying to buy a decoy. And my sister, she continued, will be perfectly positioned to arrest everyone involved once we expose the conspiracy. It's a win-win situation. She paused, assuming, of course, we don't all end up dead or imprisoned ourselves. That's your plan? Vim asked incredulously. Steal an ultra-secret military project while surrounded by the galaxy's most dangerous criminals? Of course not, Lady Shade replied smoothly. That's just what we want everyone to think is the plan. The real plan is much more interesting. Her cybernetic eye glowed brighter. And it starts with teaching my nephew how to properly modify spy equipment. After all, if he's going to insist on being part of this operation, he might as well learn from the best. Derek's face lit up like a supernova. The crew's expressions, however, suggested they were watching their simple life of coffee smuggling fade into a distant, fond memory. Now then, Lady Shade said, producing what looked suspiciously like an actual professional spy kit from her flowing robes. Shall we begin your real education in espionage, nephew? The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor, and somewhere in Tampa Station, Admiral Constantine was probably laughing at them all. First rule of espionage, Lady Shade announced, circling the crew like a predator sizing up prey. Forget everything you learned from spy novels. Derek, who had been excitedly flipping through what appeared to be a handwritten manual titled Space Pirate's Guide to Covert Ops, deflated visibly. Even the part about hidden wrist lasers. Especially that part, his aunt replied, smoothly confiscating the manual. Real spycraft is subtle. It's about blending in, not standing out, which is why, she turned to face the crew, we're going to completely rebuild your criminal personas. For the next several hours, Lady Shade transformed the Wide Margins cargo hold into an impromptu spy academy. The lessons were unconventional. No, she barked as Cass attempted to swagger into the room. You're trying too hard to look dangerous. Real criminals don't try to look dangerous. They're too busy actually being dangerous. Walk like you're bored with everything around you. And you, she pointed at Derek, who was attempting to modify yet another piece of kitchen equipment. Real spies use actual spy equipment. Put down that waffle iron before you accidentally signal every patrol ship in the sector. The crew learned the art of subtle communication, proper infiltration techniques, and how to maintain cover stories under pressure. Lady Shade was a merciless instructor. The option will be full of people who eat amateur criminals for breakfast, she explained while demonstrating proper poisoning techniques using the ship's coffee maker. One slip in your cover story, one wrong gesture, and we'll all end up spacing ourselves to avoid worse fates. Is that why you're teaching us 17 different ways to serve poisoned drinks? Vim asked, watching in fascination as Lady Shade turned their last batch of smuggled coffee into something that could probably eat through hull plating. That's just a hobby of mine, but it does tend to make people nervous when they realize you know how to turn their favorite beverage into a weapon of mass destruction. As the training continued, something became increasingly clear. Lady Shade wasn't just teaching them to maintain cover, she was preparing them for war. The mole isn't working alone, she revealed during a lesson on electronic surveillance. They're part of a larger organization, one that's been infiltrating governments across the sector for years. Project Lazarus is just their latest target. And we're supposed to stop them? Mac asked incredulously. Lady Shade's cybernetic eye glowed ominously. No, we're supposed to make them think we're trying to stop them. The real plan, she smiled, showing just a hint of fang, is something even my dear sister doesn't know about yet. Derek, who had finally managed to create something that actually functioned as spy gear, though it still suspiciously resembled kitchen equipment, looked up eagerly. What's the real plan? The real plan, dear nephew, is why I insisted on training you personally. Lady Shade's expression turned serious. Because when everything goes wrong, and it will go wrong, you're going to be our secret weapon. The crew exchanged worried glances. They'd gone from coffee smugglers to covert operatives to pawns in what was clearly a much larger game, and somehow their teenage stowaway had become central to whatever Lady Shade was really planning. Now then, she said, producing what appeared to be an actual professional-grade spy kit, let's teach you how to properly hide weapons in formal wear. The auction's dress code is quite strict after all. As Derek eagerly dove into his aunt's lessons, Cass couldn't help but wonder if they'd all been better off when their biggest worry was avoiding customs patrols. But watching Lady Shade teach her nephew how to turn seemingly innocent objects into sophisticated spy gear, he realized they were long past the point of no return. The real question was, whose plan were they really part of? The Admiral's, Lady Shade's, or something even more complicated? The answer, they would soon discover, was yes to all of the above. 3 hours until we reach the auction station, Zip announced from the bridge, his voice tense with anticipation. The wide margins galley had been transformed into what looked like a high-end boutique exploded inside a weapons depot. Lady Shade moved among the crew, making final adjustments to their disguises and equipment. Remember, she said, adjusting Cass's ridiculously ornate collar, you're not just smugglers pretending to be high-level criminals, you're criminals pretending to be legitimate business people pretending to be criminals, layers within layers. How does that even work? Vim asked, struggling with a dress that probably cost more than their entire coffee smuggling operation. Like this, Lady Shade demonstrated, suddenly shifting her entire demeanor. Her aristocratic bearing melted away, replaced by the nervous energy of someone trying too hard to appear dangerous. Then, just as quickly, she shifted again, becoming a perfect image of a bored, wealthy trader. See? Everyone at the auction will be playing a role. The trick is to play the role they expect, while being something else entirely. Derek, meanwhile, had been transformed from a wannabe space pirate into what appeared to be a perfectly proper young business heir. His aunt had somehow managed to tame his wild hair, dress him in an impeccably tailored suit, and teach him to move with practiced disdain. Stop fidgeting with the cufflinks, Lady Shade chided. They're not just for show, they contain enough encrypted data to buy a small planet, or blow one up, depending on which button you press. Which button does which? Derek asked, suddenly holding his arms very still. That's for me to know and you to figure out if we need to make a quick escape. Her cybernetic eye whirred as she surveyed her work. Now, let's review the plan one last time. The crew gathered around the galley table, now covered in holographic blueprints of the auction station. Cass and Vim will play our public faces, the successful criminals looking to move up in the world. Mac and Bread will be our visible security. Nid and Zip will monitor communications from the ship. And Derek will stay out of trouble, Cass suggested hopefully. Lady Shade smiled. Derek will be our insurance policy. No one expects the pampered heir to be anything more than decoration, which makes him perfect for what we really need. And what exactly do we really need? Cass asked, not entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. We need chaos, Lady Shade replied simply. Controlled chaos, precisely timed and perfectly executed, while everyone is focused on the Sci-Fi auction, will be... The ship's proximity alarm suddenly blared to life. Now these ships dropping out of hyperspace, Zip's voice came through the comm. Military signatures, but they're not Republican Navy. Lady Shade's expression shifted from mild annoyance to genuine concern, a change that terrified the crew more than the alarm. Well, she said, her cybernetic eye glowing brighter. It seems someone else has decided to crash our party early. Derek, dear, I believe it's time for your first practical lesson in espionage. Really? Derek's face lit up. Indeed. Rule number 1 of real spy work. When someone interrupts your carefully laid plans, she produced what looked like a normal datapad, but was definitely not normal at all. You make them regret it spectacularly. As the crew rushed to their stations and Lady Shade began rapidly typing commands into her device, Cass couldn't help but notice that Derek's proper air disguise had already begun to slip, revealing the gleam of adventure in his eyes. They were about to crash their own party before it even began, and somehow Cass suspected this was exactly what Lady Shade had been preparing them for all along. The wide margins engines roared to life, ready to show these uninvited guests why you should never interrupt a family of spies in the middle of a con. Unidentified vessels, this is a restricted sector, a cold voice crackled through the wide margins comm system. Power down your engines and prepare for boarding. Lady Shade's cybernetic eye flickered with amusement as she took control of the ship's communication array. My dear Captain, she purred into the comm, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. Do you make a habit of threatening vessels under consortium protection, or is this simply your first day on the job? The mention of the consortium, a shadowy organization that even hardened criminals spoke of in whispers, caused a noticeable pause in the transmission. Identify yourselves, the voice demanded, though with considerably less confidence. Watch and learn, Lady Shade whispered to the crew before continuing her performance. I am Lady Shade, representing certain interested parties. The wide margin carries my personal authorization codes. Perhaps you'd like to explain to the consortium why you're delaying our arrival at their event. While she spoke, her fingers danced across her mysterious data pad. On the ship's screens, complex code sequences flowed like digital water. What are you doing? Derek whispered, peering over his aunt's shoulder. Creating chaos, dear nephew. Rule number 2 of real spy work. Always have multiple ways to make your enemies fight each other. The military vessel's response came back hesitant. We're detecting no consortium authorization codes. Check again, Lady Shade commanded, pressing a final button on her pad with flourish. Suddenly, the military ship's communications erupted with confusion. Sir, we're receiving multiple high-level authorization codes. They're coming from 3 different consortium cells. Wait, these are counterintelligence markers. Lady Shade's smile turned predatory. And now, the coup de grace. She typed one more command. The military ship's formation broke as their internal communications descended into chaos, each vessel apparently receiving different, conflicting orders. What did you do? Cass asked, watching in amazement as their would-be attackers began arguing among themselves. I convinced each ship that the others might be compromised by rival factions, Lady Shade explained. They're now too busy suspecting each other to bother with us, and more importantly, her cybernetic eye gleamed. We now know who sent them. How? Derek asked, still watching the military ship's disarray with fascination. Because, dear nephew, only 3 organizations in this sector have the resources for this kind of operation, and only one of them would be sloppy enough to use ships with traceable registration numbers. She showed him her datapad's screen. See these code sequences? They're signed. Someone wants us to know who's trying to stop us. Why? Vim asked, adjusting her elaborate dress as she watched the chaos unfold. Because? Lady Shade's expression turned serious. They're not trying to stop us. They're sending us a message. And more importantly, she glanced at Derek with an unreadable expression. They're testing us. As the military ships continued their confused dance through space, Lady Shade turned to her nephew. This is why I insisted on training you personally. The real game isn't about the Cipher or Project Lazarus. It's about something much bigger. And you, dear nephew, are going to help me prove a point to some very powerful people. What point? Derek asked, his eyes shining with excitement. That the next generation of spies doesn't play by the old rules. She handed him her datapad. Now, shall we show them what happens when they underestimate a teenager with proper training? As Derek began working with his aunt's equipment, his fingers flying over the controls with surprising skill, Cass realized they weren't just heading to an auction anymore. They were walking into a generational power play between rival spy networks. And somehow, their coffee smuggling crew had ended up right in the middle of it. Set course for the auction station, Lady Shade commanded. It's time to crash this party properly. The wide margins engines hummed to life, leaving behind a cluster of confused military vessels, still trying to figure out who they could trust. Rule number 3 of real spy work, as they were learning. The best way to win a game is to change all the rules. The auction station loomed before them, a massive structure of gleaming metal and shadowy docking bays. Originally built as a luxury resort for the sector's elite, it had been abandoned during the last economic crisis and repurposed by those who preferred to conduct their business away from prying eyes. Remember, Lady Shade instructed as they approached their assigned docking bay. From this moment on, we're being watched. Every gesture, every word, every breath will be analyzed. No pressure, Mac muttered, adjusting his security officer uniform for the 100th time. The wide margins docking procedure was flawless. It had to be. As Cass had learned during their training, even the way a ship docked could reveal things about its crew to observant eyes. Incoming transmission, Zip announced from the bridge. A holographic figure materialized in the ship's main compartment, another masked individual, though this one's mask was adorned with swirling patterns that seemed to move in the light. Lady Shade, the figure's modulated voice carried a hint of amusement. We wondered if you'd make it past our welcoming committee. My dear Sci-Fi, Lady Shade replied smoothly, if that was your idea of a welcome, we really must discuss your hospitality standards. Derek, standing perfectly poised in his air persona, caught the subtle hand signal from his aunt. His fingers moved across his cufflinks in a precise pattern, initiating whatever programs she had hidden within them. And this must be the infamous crew of the Wide Margin, the masked figure continued. Along with your protégé? Indeed, Lady Shade's cybernetic eye whirred almost imperceptibly. I trust our credentials are in order. Why, though I must admit we're curious about your sudden interest in our little gathering. Curiosity is the mark of an intelligent mind, Lady Shade replied cryptically. Though in this case, perhaps it would be better to discuss such matters in person. The masked figure seemed to study them for a moment before responding. Indeed, your docking clearance is confirmed. Welcome to the Gilded Shadow. As the transmission ended, Lady Shade's composed demeanor shifted slightly. They're testing us already, Derek. Got it, he whispered, showing her his cufflink display. 7 different scanning frequencies during that transmission. They were trying to penetrate our security protocol. And they got exactly what you wanted them to see, corrupted data suggesting we're hiding something, but not what we're actually hiding. Lady Shade's smile showed just a hint of pride. Well done, nephew. Now places everyone. The real performance is about to begin. The crew moved into their assigned positions, each playing their part in this elaborate deception. Cass and Vim took the lead, projecting an air of dangerous sophistication. Mac and Red flanked them as security, while Nid and Zip prepared to monitor communications from the ship. As the airlock cycled open, revealing the opulent interior of the auction station, Cass couldn't help but notice how naturally Derek had fallen into his role. The awkward teenager trying to be a space pirate was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. A young spy who had learned from the best. Remember, Lady Shade whispered as they prepared to disembark, everyone here is playing a part. The trick is figuring out which part is real and which is the deception. And what part are we playing? Cass asked quietly. All of them, she replied with a predatory smile. And none of them. Now shall we go steal some secrets? The crew of the Wide Margin stepped onto the auction station, ready to perform the greatest con of their lives. Behind them, hidden in plain sight among their legitimate cargo, sat enough sophisticated spy technology to make a military intelligence officer weep. The game was about to begin, and as Derek had learned from his aunt, the best players were the ones no one suspected of knowing the real rules. The interior of the auction station was a study in calculated excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their light reflecting off polished marble floors. Security drones disguised as decorative orbs floated silently through the air, their scanning beams hidden behind ornamental patterns. 7 cameras in this room alone, Derek murmured, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he'd been taught. 4 visible, 3 hidden in the chandelier crystals. 8, Lady Shade corrected softly. You missed the one in the floor mosaic. Remember, nephew, in this world, even the art is watching. The crew moved through the station's grand atrium like they belonged there, each playing their part to perfection. Cass and Vim led the way, their expensive outfits and carefully practiced swagger drawing just the right amount of attention. Mac and Red followed, scanning the crowd with professional paranoia. They passed other groups of arrivals, crime lords trying to look legitimate business people trying to look dangerous, and everything in between. The air was thick with perfume, danger, and deception. Lady Shade, a silky voice called out. A tall figure in an iridescent suit approached, flanked by security droids. What an unexpected pleasure! A marquee veil, Lady Shade replied, her cybernetic eyes scanning the approaching group. Still hiding military-grade weapons in those antique droids, I see. Must keep up appearances, the Marquis smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. And speaking of appearances, his gaze shifted to Derek. I wasn't aware you had taken on an apprentice. I must plan for the future, Lady Shade replied smoothly, especially in our line of work. The exchange was interrupted by a station-wide announcement. All guests, please proceed to the main auction hall. Registration and security screening will begin shortly. Security screening, Vim whispered as they moved with the crowd. Don't worry, Lady Shade murmured. They're not looking for what we're actually carrying. The main auction hall was a massive chamber that must have once been a grand ballroom. Now it was filled with numbered tables, each surrounded by privacy fields that shimmered like soap bubbles in the light. As they were led to their assigned table, Derek's fingers moved subtly across his cufflinks, activating whatever programs his aunt had hidden within them. Lady Shade's cybernetic eye whirred almost imperceptibly in response. "The real auction isn't happening here," she whispered to the crew once they were behind their privacy field. "This is just the show. The real deals are being made in private rooms throughout the station." "Then why are we here?" Cass asked, maintaining his bored expression for the cameras. "Because, my dear Captain," Lady Shade smiled. "Sometimes the best way to hide is in plain sight. While everyone watches this elaborate performance," she gestured to the auction hall, "we'll be executing the real plan." "Which is?" Mac asked nervously. Before she could answer, another masked figure appeared on the central stage, different from the one they'd spoken to earlier, but wearing the same style of shifting patterns. "Welcome, distinguished guests," the figure announced, their voice modulated to perfect neutrality. "The auction for the quantum cipher will begin in 1 hour. Until then, please enjoy our hospitality. And remember," the mask seemed to smile somehow, "we're all friends here." "No," Lady Shade whispered, her cybernetic eye fixed on the masked figure. "We're all liars here, and that's exactly what we're counting on." Derek's cufflinks pulsed once, silently, as programs hidden in their elaborate design began their work. The real game was about to begin, and the crew of the Wide Margin was about to learn that in the world of high-stakes espionage, nothing was what it seemed. Not even their own mission. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of indeterminate classification," the masked announcer's voice echoed through the auction hall. "Registration will now commence. Please have your credentials ready for verification." The Wide Margin's crew watched as various groups approached the central platform, each undergoing elaborate security scans disguised as formal introductions. It was like watching a deadly dance, where one wrong step could lead to immediate elimination. "Table 17, a melodious voice called out. "Their turn." Lady Shade rose with practiced grace, Derek at her side matching her movements perfectly. Cass and Vim followed, while Mac and Red maintained their positions with professional vigilance. As they approached the platform, Derek's cufflinks pulsed in a complex pattern. Lady Shade's cybernetic eye whirred almost imperceptibly in response. "Lady Shay," the masked figure greeted them. "And the illustrious crew of the Wide Margin, your credentials, please?" What happened next was so subtle that even most trained observers would have missed it. As Lady Shade presented their documentation, Derek executed a perfect aristocratic bow, and in doing so, activated a cascade of hidden programs throughout the station's security network. "Everything appears to be in order," the masked figure announced after a moment, but there was a slight tension in their voice that hadn't been there before. As they returned to their table, Lady Shade whispered, 3, 2, 1. The station's lights flickered for a fraction of a second, so briefly that most guests probably attributed it to their imagination or the effects of expensive drinks. "What did we just do?" Cass asked under his breath. "We didn't do anything," Lady Shade replied with a predatory smile. "But thanks to my nephew's performance, every security system in this station now has a shadow program running alongside it, one that will show our hosts exactly what they expect to see, while we—" She paused meaningfully. Will we what?" Vim asked, maintaining her bored expression for the cameras. "Will we execute the real mission?" Derek finished, his eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement, "which begins in exactly 47 seconds. "And what happens in 47 seconds?" Mac whispered nervously. Lady Shade's smile widened. "That's when the first of our little surprises reveals itself to our hosts. You see, while everyone here is focused on the cipher auction," she gestured subtly to where several other guests were already engaging in preliminary negotiations, "we're about to start a very different kind of bidding war." "What kind of—" Cass began, but was interrupted by another station-wide announcement. "Attention all guests, we are detecting some minor technical difficulties. Please remain at your assigned tables while our security systems perform a routine diagnostic." "Minor technical difficulties?" Red muttered. "Oh no," Lady Shade replied, her cybernetic eye glowing with satisfaction. "They're about to discover that their problems are anything but minor. Derek, dear, shall we show them what happens when they underestimate the next generation of spies?" Derek's fingers moved across his cufflinks in a complex pattern, and somewhere in the station's vast network of security systems, chaos began to unfold. The real auction was about to begin, but it wasn't the one anyone else was expecting. And as the crew of the Wide Margin watched their teenage companion orchestrate what was clearly going to be a spectacular security breach, they couldn't help but wonder, had they just helped start a war, or prevent one? The answer, they would soon discover, was both. "Security breach in Sector 7, a computerized voice announced calmly. "Containment protocols engaged." Lady Shade checked her chronometer with theatrical precision. Right on schedule. Around the auction hall, other guests began to shift uncomfortably. The masked figures on the platform huddled in urgent consultation, their elaborate disguises doing little to hide their growing concern. What exactly did we do? Cass whispered, maintaining his bored expression even as his tail twitched with anxiety. We didn't do anything, Derek replied softly, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced nonchalance. We just helped several other interested parties do quite a lot. Lady Shade's cybernetic eye whirred in approval. You see, while everyone here is focused on buying the quantum cipher, at least 3 different factions are attempting to steal it. What they don't realize is, the cipher isn't really here, Derek finished, his eyes gleaming. But something else is. Another announcement cut through the growing tension. Security breach in Sector 12, all security personnel to designated response point. The auction hall erupted into controlled chaos. Guests tried to maintain their dignified facades while clearly preparing for potential violence. Security droids moved into defensive positions, their weapons no longer concealed. And now, Lady Shade murmured, for the real performance. Derek's cufflinks pulsed once more, and suddenly every privacy field in the auction hall flickered with static. For a brief moment, each table's occupants could see every other table, and more importantly, recognize who else was attending the auction. The result was immediate and spectacular. That's Senator Vale's chief of staff. Is that the proconsul of the Rigel Consortium? Why is the Republican Navy's head of intelligence here? The masked figures on the platform frantically tried to restore order, but the damage was done. In revealing everyone's identity simultaneously, Derek had turned the auction into a political powder keg. You see, Lady Shade explained to her increasingly pale crew, the real value isn't in what people are trying to buy or steal, it's in knowing who's trying to buy or steal it. And now everyone knows everyone else is here, Vin realized, her eyes widening. Precisely, which means Lady Shade's smile turned predatory. No one can afford to let anyone else leave with that information. As if on cue, the station's lights flickered again, and a new announcement echoed through the halls. Emergency lockdown protocols initiated. All guests are required to remain in their current locations. And that, Derek said with satisfaction, is how you turn an auction into a trap. The crew of the Wide Margin watched in amazement as their teenage companion's elaborate plan unfolded. They had just helped turn the galaxy's most exclusive black market auction into a political crisis that would shake governments across the sector. But what about the real cipher? Cass asked. And Project Lazarus? Lady Shade's cybernetic eye glowed with dangerous amusement. No, that's the best part. While everyone here is trapped in this lovely diplomatic nightmare, she gestured to the chaos around them. Someone else entirely is making their move. Who? Mac whispered. That, my dear smugglers, is what we're about to find out. She turned to her nephew. Derek, I believe it's time for Phase 2. The boy's answering smile was eerily similar to his aunt's. Finally, the real fun begins. The crew exchanged worried glances. Somehow they suspected that their definition of fun was about to be dramatically revised. Again. As chaos erupted throughout the station, Lady Shade revealed the final piece of their elaborate plan. The real quantum cipher and Project Lazarus data had never been intended for auction. They were bait in an elaborate trap set by Admiral Constantine herself. While the galaxy's most dangerous criminals and corrupt officials were locked in a diplomatic standoff in the auction hall, the real operation was taking place elsewhere. Derek's security breaches and identity reveals weren't just causing chaos. They were forcing every major criminal organization and corrupt government official to expose their connections. You see, Lady Shade explained as they made their way through the station's now empty corridors, your mother needed proof of how deep the corruption went. What better way than to let them expose themselves? The White Martian's crew watched from their ship as Republican Navy vessels emerged from hyperspace, led by Admiral Constantine's flagship. The auction station, still in lockdown, had become the largest single collection of criminal evidence in sector history. So we were never really here for the cipher? Cass asked, watching as ships began docking with the station. Oh, the cipher was real enough, Lady Shade smiled. But it was never about decryption. It was about proving that even the most secure systems can be compromised, not by technology, but by the people trusted to protect them. Derek, still wearing his perfect air disguise, grinned at the crew. And who better to expose corruption than a bunch of coffee smugglers and a teenage spy in training? As they watched Admiral Constantine's forces secure the station, Lady Shade turned to the crew. So, how do you feel about becoming permanent consultants for a certain branch of Republican intelligence? The pay is better than coffee smuggling, and the adventures are certainly more interesting. The crew looked at each other, then at Derek, who was already modifying another piece of kitchen equipment into something probably illegal. Do we have a choice? Cass asked. There's always a choice. Admiral Constantine's voice came through their comm system. But considering you've just helped expose the largest conspiracy in sector history, I think you've already made it. The Wide Margin's crew had gone from coffee smugglers to covert operatives to key players in galactic politics. and somehow they all knew this was just the beginning of their adventures. After all, they still had a teenage spy in training to keep out of trouble. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. Hey, space adventurers, that was quite a ride with the Wide Margin crew, wasn't it? From coffee smuggling to saving the sector with a teenage spy in training. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button faster than Derek can modify a coffee maker. Subscribe and ring that notification bell to join our growing fleet of story lovers. Want more tales from the depths of space? You know what to do. Until next time, this is your favorite space storyteller signing off. Stay sneaky, friends.